I was a college student from 1964 to 68, precisely at the time that the war in Vietnam was going through a kind of dramatic period of escalation. When it first began, most of us who were just entering college were tended to be supportive of the war. I mean, it was our country at war, and so we kind of didn't think beyond that. The more time went by and the bigger the war became, the more certain it became that we were going to have to make life and death decisions about what we thought about it. Were we going to go and fight, or did it seem like something we didn't want to do? And so that was the kind of discussion that began kind of naturally on campus. Certainly the predominant sentiment on campus up through the end of 1966 and into 1967 was probably supportive of the war. But there were, in those days, some very articulate students and a few professors who were raising kind of intellectual arguments about the war, talking about the history of Vietnam, talking about the history of outside occupiers, including France and Japan, and the possibility that people, communist and non-communist alike in Vietnam, would see the United States as a part of that tradition, not as the liberator who saved South Vietnam from communism, but as another in a sequence of foreign occupiers of their territory. So that became kind of the abstract historical argument that you began to hear people make. And the more I read and the more I studied the issue, the more I thought there was something to that. It wasn't that I had great faith in the government of Ho Chi Minh or anything like that, but it was clear that the government in South Vietnam was not a very popular government, and so those kind of debates began to happen on campus. And my role for a long time was just to try to facilitate that discussion. I mean, I was involved in organizations to bring speakers to campus. We had speakers as diverse from Senator Barry Goldwater on the conservative side of the issue to Senator Robert Kennedy on the more anti-war side of the issue. Martin Luther King came and talked about the war some. When Robert Kennedy came and spoke at Vanderbilt in 1968 and said some very strong and firm things against the war and about poverty and civil rights, that same day he had spoken at the University of Alabama. There were 11,000 people that heard him at Vanderbilt. There were, I think, more than 9,000 that heard him at the University of Alabama. So there was that measurement of at least a growing curiosity, a growing openness to hearing views opposed to the prevailing American policy at the time. You could see it when people like that would come to campus. When Martin Luther King came to campus, and by 1967, when he came, he had begun to speak out against the war at some risk to his civil rights movement because he lost the alliance with Lyndon Johnson. I remember, though, for me, the point at which it became a different kind of issue was early in 1967, and I read an issue of Ramparts magazine, and it had an article about the Vietnam War that was accompanied with a lot of pictures of Vietnamese children who had been wounded just in horrifying ways by napalm. And seeing those pictures and reading the commentary that went along with them, and realizing that my country was doing this, made it an emotional issue for me as well as an intellectual issue. And then there was another piece of it too. I had friends who went and fought. I had a friend who believed deeply in the cause of anti-communism, and he went and he fought. And he got shot through the spine. and was paralyzed from the waist down. And so I began to see the toll that it took on my own friends who had the courage of their convictions. When I would come home to Mobile and would get in conversations about the war with relatives, with friends who were, especially friends of the family who were a little bit older, they were sometimes quite angry with me because I expressed opposition to the policies of my government. It was still, these were part of the World War II generation where, if your country was at war, it just seemed almost unnatural to them for somebody to oppose the policy, unpatriotic to oppose the policy. I always, though, tried to make a distinction in my mind between my dispute with the policymakers of the U.S. government and my feelings about people my age who were fighting the war. I did not like it when friends of mine came home and were sometimes greeted rudely by people whose views on the war had changed and were treated as if they were, were treated very badly, were treated with hostility when they came back from having put their lives on the line, and in a conflict that, for some of them, made less and less sense the longer they were there. Some of them would talk to me about how they were never quite sure who the enemy was going to be. The fact that there was, by the late 60s, a broad outcry against the war from kind of sort of center left anyway. There was a pretty strong wave of opposition to the war. And so, because of that, Lyndon Johnson, I think that was one of the reasons that he didn't run for re-election in 1968, because the anti-war movement had buoyed the candidacies of Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy for president, and they certainly wanted to do something different with regard to the war. So there was that aspect. We'd like to think that we are the most powerful nation on earth with the most powerful military on earth, and therefore, and that we have a sense of doing what's right as a nation, and therefore that those things together should mean that the world should bend to our will. That didn't happen for us in Vietnam. It hasn't always happened very predictably in the Middle East. And so I think that's an uncomfortable question that we still have to wrestle with. And I think the difficulties in wrestling with that today are similar to those I remember from the 60s. People question your patriotism sometimes if you raise those kind of questions, and yet I think they have to be raised. Realistically, our place in the world, in a very complicated world, goes beyond that sort of black and white Cold War definition. There's us on the good side, and there is the Soviet Union and communism on the bad side, and wherever we see communism, we have to oppose it. So it's a complicated world, and we don't like those kind of complications.